So let's talk about the different types of speciation. So the different ways in which new species can come to be. Turns out that for the most part, the different types of speciation are based off of whether or not there is a geographic barrier between the two populations that form different species. So the first type, allopatric speciation, occurs if there is a geographic barrier that causes reproductive isolation. So you have an original population, then you have some barrier that forms that causes reproductive isolation, and over time, the two populations evolve to the point where they become two actual different species. And there's actually two different types of allopatric speciation. One is vicariance and one is dispersal. So vicariance is exactly what I just described. You have species A, you have a geographic barrier that forms, and then after reproductive isolation occurs, you get two different species that evolve as a result of this. Dispersal is, what we've been talking about, where you have a species and then a few members of that species disperses over some barrier to an isolated area, and then little to no gene flow occurs. And so these two evolve independently of one another, and you get a new species that evolves as a result of this. Here's an example of vicariance. So there's these South Pacific, Indonesian frog species, group of species that evolved as a result of vicariance over millions of years through the breakup of Gondwana, which you're sort of seeing in sequence here as India and those land masses broke off of Africa and eventually collided with Eurasia. Over time, so that basically you get a geographic barrier that formed between those species, and we can trace the evolutionary changes to those through time for these frog species. So there's this temporal and spatial aspect of these allopatric speciation events, and we'll talk more about how the geologic history really plays a role in understanding the evolutionary patterns that we see in biogeography. And sort of to continue on that note, it really makes a difference in the phylogenetic relationships, whether you have vicariance or dispersal. So some of the ways we can sort out whether it was vicariance or dispersal, or how, if we know is one of these, how that might help us organize our phylogenetic cladograms here. So if you have vicariance, maybe you have a single species here, then you have this geographic barrier that forms, and two new species are formed as a result of that, both of which are descendants of the original species A. Similarly, you can have multiple species or multiple geographic barriers that form and cause multiple speciation events. So you have your common ancestor A, but gives rise to B and C and D and E here. If C were to split up, also, if you have subsequent geographic barriers that form. If you have dispersal, then the relationships can be a little bit different. So you can have your original population here, and then you could have these dispersal events that occur to the individual. Like, let's say you have some isolated areas and you have a few members that disperse here, and a few members that disperse there, and a few members that disperse here, could create a phylogenetic relationship like this, where it's sort of they're all, and the original species can then coexist, continue to exist here. And so you have this sort of branching pattern in your phylogenetic tree here. Another scenario would be you have your original ancestor species here, and then you get a dispersal event, a single event to location in this location, and you get species B here, and so you get this sort of relationship. Or you can have these subsequent events where you get A and then B and then C, and so you have your species A here, which is it gives rise to species B and C, or A, B, and C. I think I said this backwards. I'm realizing you could have a location where species B exists here and then disperses to a larger area, and you can get this sort of relationship, or you can get the reverse of that. Um, just showing that these could be reversed also there. And you can get subsequent relationships or dispersal events too. So the main point here is that it's going to matter. The phylogenetic relationships are going to be different depending on how this happens. You might just think, oh, there's a barrier and these two different species form, and that's the end of it. But it's not necessarily the case. You're going to get very different evolutionary relationships among these different organisms, among these different types of events. So our other two types, so that was allopatric. These other two tend to get lumped together, but they're different things. So there's sympatric and parapatric speciation. Both of them occur as a result of reproductive isolation without a geographic barrier. Sympatric is you have your original population, and then completely within that you have some reproductive isolation that happens as a result of something. And you get speciation within the same population. So there's no geographic barrier. These organisms all exist in the same place, but for whatever reason, certain organisms were only reproducing with other certain types of organisms, and you get this sort of thing. Parapatric is if you have some geographic gradient or climb, and which is, this happens a lot in it's a geological or geographical feature that you might have gradual changes in some characteristic of the environment. So you might get this gradual change, and maybe in the center you get this hybrid zone that's sort of in between both, and you can get some hybridization maybe occurs there originally or at first, and then eventually you can get a separation of the species altogether if organisms are not reproducing from here with organisms over there. So this one is sympatric. This one down here is parapatric. They're kind of hard. It's kind of hard to distinguish and find examples of this, but there are some known examples of sympatric speciation. So Lake Malawi in Africa, the cichlids. There's many different types of cichlids within this one lake. And so you get these different populations, and probably this has evolved, and we'll talk more about this in a second, but to evolve different resource utilization to reduce competition. And I'll come back to that idea here shortly. Another example of sympatric speciation, again, in an aquatic system where you have these fish which all live together but have all evolved basically different resource utilization. So not all of them eat the exact same or prey upon the exact same species within this lake system. So let's come back to this idea. Let's talk about diversification, specifically diversification within the same population. I want to introduce this idea of competitive exclusion. It may have been something that we've talked about a little bit before. I don't know if I've given a formal definition here, or at least sort of an explanation of what's going on. So species that are extremely similar in their niches tend to have non-overlapping geographic distributions, whereas species that coexist in the same area and habitat tend to differ substantially in their resource use. So what's going on is basically you have two options. If you're a species that's very similar to another species, these are pictures of foxes. they're in competition, I guess. I don't know if it makes sense, but if you have two similar species here, you have two options. Basically, you can go somewhere else, so you don't have to compete, or you can exist in the same space and figure out a way to not compete as much so that there's not as much selective pressure on both species, because that's probably not going to be beneficial for either one, really. So what happens is you either go somewhere else or you use different resources in the same location. And so there's lots of examples of this. So here's some, it's a very interesting looking grasshopper, which has some very distinct and for the most part not overlapping geographic ranges, but they're very similar species. We tend to call these sibling species. They are different. There's, for these grasshoppers, there's some chromosome differences, which you're seeing indicated here. But there is this area where a lot of them exist very closely along a transect, and they sampled along some transects and found that the allele frequency of some nucleotides changed very abruptly along this transect. So if you travel just along the transect, you get very abrupt changes in allele frequency along these these spots on the chromosome. So some pretty harsh transitions, pretty distinct, and that happens a lot with these closely related species. The other side of that is sort of the adaptive radiation side, where instead of having different ranges, you are all forced to exist in the same place. Then adaptive radiation occurs when similar species occupy the same space and thus develop different resource uses. So Darwin's finches are a great example, classic example of this, where the beak morphology of these species, when they colonized the Galapagos Islands, they were probably all either maybe one species or very closely similarly related species, evolved into completely different species based off of their beak morphology, allowed them to eat different seed sources and utilize different food sources. And so you see the frequency of the beak depth or the beak size changes or is changed between these different species. So they basically evolved to utilize different resources so that they could coexist and survive. Okay, so those are some types of speciation. Keep working your way through. There's a reading here that will hopefully reinforce some of these ideas and maybe explain it a little bit more clearly. So keep working your way through the module. I'll see you in the next video.